is legitimizing this revolt. And on Christian Freedom, Luther wrote that all people, rich and poor, are equal in the eyes of God. Now, what Luther meant there, of course, was that all people are equal in the eyes of God, meaning when they go to heaven. And that, there's plenty of biblical testimony to this, that everyone passes the same test when he goes into heaven, whether you're rich or poor on the earth, it doesn't matter in the next life. And that's what Luther was saying. But again, the peasants interpret this to be saying that all people, rich and poor, are equal in the eyes of God on earth. And they're saying, well, we've not been treated as equals, so we're going to rise up and demand we be treated as equals. We're going to take what's rightly ours. We're going to claim our position. We're going to be equals. That's the rhetoric that's coming out of this huge peasant revolt. The peasants are simply attempting to overthrow the rich and take their share of wealth and power. They even claim that the Bible supports them in this. They say, well, the Bible says the meek shall inherit the earth, and we're meek, and so we're now in the process of inheriting the earth. It's hard to overestimate the drama of a situation like this. Most peasant revolts in the early modern period were simply furious, undirected, unthought out riots of starving, impoverished people who were rejecting, maybe a wage freeze or taxes or other cruel treatment by the leaders of society and by the landlords. And peasant revolts are always crushed and always amount to very little, although causing much chaos, destruction, and death. This is the first time that a peasant revolt, or in fact any kind of revolt, had adopted religious ideas as a kind of ideology to claim a whole lot more than exactly what their agenda was. How many of the peasants actually believed that these ideas of Luther were spurring them on, and how many were just, cynically using them? There's no way to know. It is interesting to note that, the revolt is led by a number of Lutheran preachers, and these Lutheran ideas are certainly filtering into the masses through the preachers. What the preachers' motivations, intentions were, again, is not clear because there are no records about it. But the peasant war, as it's called, peasant revolt, is a traumatic event in German history. Even today, it's remembered as a disaster. And in those days, it just changed the course of the entire Reformation. When Luther heard what was happening, think about Luther's reaction to the Wittenberg situation, which was a relatively small-scale explosion of extreme activity using his ideas as a foundation and basis. But now you got a massive popular revolution sweeping across almost all of Germany, involving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people using Luther's ideas as legitimacy. Well, Luther is horrified. Because politically and socially speaking, Luther is no revolutionary. Politically and socially speaking, Luther is a pretty conservative guy. And the first thing he sees, the first thing he believes, is that the peasants have heard his ideas and have totally misunderstood them, like many people in Wittenberg had. And certainly that was in part the case. Probably a number of peasants had just simply misunderstood Luther's ideas, or they'd been taught something about Luther's ideas that wasn't correct. So there is that possibility that there are a large number of people just mistaken about it. But it also dawns on Luther that his ideas are being used. They're being cynically used for purposes that aren't his at all and he would never support. And he starts to realize that the ideology of the Reformation, which is essentially his ideology, can be more than just transformative in the theological realm. It has the potential for being a socially revolutionary doctrine. And this frightens the stuffings out of Luther. Luther honestly believes, and most people in Luther's position at that time believed, that these peasants are inferior. They are an inferior class on earth. Maybe when they go to heaven they won't be, but now they're inferior. And he believed that totally and wasn't at all willing to change his position on that. He ended up writing 2 books, which he hoped would kind of end the peasant revolt, but you know, I guess it's wishful thinking to hope that a book will end a social uprising like this. In the first book, his major message was that the Bible demanded that citizens obey their rulers, because those rulers are put on earth by God to rule. They are ordained by God to rule. It's part of God's intent and plan they rule, and that people have no right to rise up and overthrow these rulers. In fact, if you do rise up and overthrow them, you've essentially gone against the Bible and become, I guess, a heretic. And I really think that was the core of Luther's political belief. But that didn't have any effect. No one really listened to that very much. His second book really shocked people. He came out and said, essentially, to the princes and rulers of Germany, this revolt by the peasants is not just illegitimate and dangerous. It's worse than that, because the peasants are inspired by the devil. So it's diabolical. And it's your duty to go out there and crush this rebellion and, you know, kill peasants. The rulers then are glad to do that. They form armies together. They go out into the field. They crush the peasant revolt, slaughtering who knows how many thousands of peasants, making a huge impact on German society for many years to come. At this point, Luther is absolutely certain that the common people will probably misunderstand his ideas. And he gives up the idea of reforming the church by directly appealing to the people. His new plan is this. He will preach instead to the princes and rulers of Germany. He will convert them to Lutheranism, and then they will in turn convert their territories and the people in them by law to Lutheranism. So it's going to be a kind of reform by government decree. This begins the stage of the Reformation known as the Magisterial Reformation. And it's called that just from the German word Magister, which means ruler or, you know, authority in German. And what it shows you is that the Reformation, which had started out being a popular movement, and we can see it was a very popular movement. I mean, you know, think of all the people who turned out on Luther's trip to Worms. Think of all the people who became followers while Luther was in hiding. I mean, it was initially a grassroots, popular, mass movement. Now it's turning into something else. With Luther's change in strategy, it's turning into essentially a political movement. Because Luther is going to become dependent on the princes, rulers, politicians to essentially carry out the Reformation. And when you do that, what happens next is pretty obvious. Religion is going to get mixed up in politics. Politics is going to get mixed up in religion. Issues that initially are religious issues will be political issues, and political issues will become religious issues. And you're going to have a kind of intertwining of these things, which can become very, very complicated. And I'm not at all sure that Luther thought through much of this when he determined the new course he was going to follow. And I doubt very much he saw the future consequences of it, which essentially will be the division of Germany into 2 parts and the outbreak of disastrous religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants. But that's a little bit farther down the road. As it turns out, by the way Luther is going here, preaching to the princes and having them convert their states, the new Lutheran churches that are established become state churches, controlled by the state. And I say churches, not church, because there really is no one Lutheran church. There's a separate Lutheran church in every little territory and province and princedom that converts Lutheranism. So there's a Saxon Lutheran church, there's a Brandenburg Lutheran Church. There's a number of different churches, but they're all Lutheran, following basically Luther's ideas, but they are controlled by the state rulers, the state governments, and they are basically state churches. This movement, though, begins to really pick up steam, and it appears to Luther to be working out very well, because he finds that there are a lot of princes out there, a lot of rulers in Germany, who will happily convert themselves to Lutheranism and then happily convert their state and people to Lutheranism. Why are they so happy to do it? Is it because they believe in Luther and like his ideas? I mean, that's possible in some cases, that was why they did it. But in most cases, I think you have to look at more political motivations. Most of these rulers are going to jump at the opportunity to reject papal control over the church. Because once they reject papal control over the church, they can take control over the church, at least in their territories. Which means they will have the power to make all the church appointments, which means immense amounts of patronage. They will have the ability now to take those church revenues that used to go off to Rome every year and put them in their treasury. They will be able to use church land in ways they want to. I mean, and there are many ways you can use church land, and the church owned a lot of land. The church probably owned something like a quarter of the total amount of land in Germany, or something near that. And now these princes will have access to that land. Either they can use it to extract revenues from it. Say it's land formerly owned by a monastery, which has peasants working on it. The peasants are producing agricultural products that are being sold, and then the profits go to the monastery, which is always the way it used to be when it was a Catholic church. Now what's going to happen is that the prince will be able to take the profits of that land. He'll pay some to the monastery to keep it going if he wants to, but in many cases they just simply abolish the monastery. In many other cases, all the monks just leave and the monastery just doesn't exist anymore. But land owned by the church, coming to be owned by the state, can be used to extract revenues in that way, or you can simply appropriate that land and sell it. Sell it to the highest bidder and put the revenues directly into your treasury. So they're happy to do it. They're happy to make the church essentially a department of their state, because it increases state power. But what we see here is a basic change in church-state relations. Throughout the whole Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had fought doggedly to maintain a separation of church and state, basically to maintain the church's independence of action from secular rulers. And now what you have in every Lutheran state is that the church and state separation has vanished. And the church becomes essentially a branch of state. Well, still we got to organize this church somehow, and Luther sees the necessity for organizing these new Lutheran churches. The Pope's gone, the bishops are gone, there's no leaders. People are asking Luther, who's going to govern the church? Luther says, the princes will govern the church. They'll be interim bishops, and they'll be the rulers of the church, the leaders of the church. So he hands them the authority over the church. Luther himself is willing to only be a theological advisor. At one point they say, will you be head of the church? And he says, we got rid of one pope, I'm not going to become another pope. So he doesn't want any kind of position like that, but he'll be an advisor. They set up consistory councils, kind of committees to govern the churches in various areas to make sure they're following as much as possible Lutheran doctrine and practices. Luther himself does make contributions. He writes a catechism for young people in the new churches. He writes up a new church service with a sermon at its center and hymns, singing many hymns himself. He himself writes. And his probably most important contribution, he makes a German translation of the Bible, which ordinary people can read. So we now have the Lutheran churches established, the Reformation well on its way, and Luther is still in some sense guiding it.